So the final phase of the Baroque is the French Baroque. Probably my favorite because I love the figure that the French Baroque is attached to, and that is the Sun King Louis XIV. And who was Louis XIV? He's King of France, and he comes into power, of course, after his father, Louis XIII. Now, Louis XIII dies when Louis XIV is quite young, and so he actually has to wait, in a sense, to rule, and his mother, the queen, is made regent. So she's sort of a placeholder for his rule until he comes of age. So he's sort of raised in the palace by a lot of different politicians and historians, right? Tutors, right? As he gets ready to rule. And one of the most famous of these people is Mazarin. And Mazarin is famous for telling Louis XIV basically that you should be your own judge of rulership, right? You should guide as you see fit. And so there's a famous quote that I give you here where he says, "Govern, let the politicians be your servants, never your master." So the idea that yes, your aides can give you good advice, but at the same time you are king. One jokes that we think Louis XIV perhaps took this advice maybe too much to heart, because he ended up being one of the most iron-fisted, sort of single-minded kings that you see, where he really doesn't know how to take no for an answer. He does as he wants. He doesn't take advice rather well, and he rules with an iron fist, where his way is the law. So he's quite severe, right, in how he rules. And he's one of the longest-lived rulers on record. So when I teach Art History 1, I often reference Ramses II, who ruled for quite some time as Pharaoh of Egypt, like 67 years. And the same thing here with Louis XIV, where he rules for like 60-some years, so he is in power for quite some time. So in a sense, his power becomes the way that the whole era is molded, because he's around for so long and he's ruling for so long. And again, he has this attitude of, I am right, I am in charge, and you're going to do as I say. This leads to him being a very, very famous king, and him having certain attitudes that infect, right, the rest of French history. Here you see the famous portrait of Louis XIV by Rigaud, and the original hangs in the Louvre. The copy hangs in the Palace of Versailles, that we'll talk about here in a minute. And I love this portrait. I think it is a great indicator of how to do a portrait in Baroque style. It's very flamboyant, it's very dramatic. There's the use of the curtains in the background, which you'll note is a very Baroque sort of set piece that you see in a lot of Baroque paintings. And everything about his attitude is, look at me, I'm a peacock, I'm on display. And this painting, to me, is about always putting your best foot forward. Always showing the public what you want them to see. Because this painting was actually painted when he was quite the old man. He was 62 years old when this painting was made. So often we talk about how he uses the painting almost to trick you into seeing youth, seeing vitality, where, again, he's quite far along in his rulership when this painting is made. How are some of the ways he signals youth to you here? His youthfulness, right? He's wearing a wig, but you'll notice it isn't the typical powdered wig of the time. It's a black wig, which, if you think about having gray hair, it would have made him look much more aged. This is why I joke, I'm seeing a few little gray hairs in my fringe, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna, color the heck out of this, because to me, it makes you aged, right? So he uses this idea of using the black hair, right, as a way of, erasing some of the age from himself. He also wears his coronation robe. So when the French kings are coronated, they are always given a special coronation robe to wear. On this one, you'll notice the color is blue, which is the color of France, and it's covered with fleur-de-lis, which are the symbol of France. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. So he's wearing this robe that goes all the way back to his coronation, or when he took power. So again, in his youth. And then finally, of course, his dancer's legs, which are on full display. When Louis XIV was young, he actually was a ballet dancer and took great pride in this. He did a lot of performances before becoming king, and was quite skilled. He also is famous for inventing the high-heeled shoe. So you'll notice he's wearing a little high-heeled shoe here in the portrait. And ladies, sorry, but it was not a woman who invented this. It was Louis XIV, and supposedly to show off his beautiful legs. If you've worn high heels, you know that the reason they're worn is because they elevate the body, they change the posture of the body, and they make your legs look stunning. Comfortable? No. Good for the physique? Yes. Good for the look? Sure. But again, you'll notice he's using everything possible to sort of advance this idea of youthfulness, the promise of that kind of youthfulness, even into his old age. He also works with some symbols here that make people understand the sort of reach of his rulership, how he controls all things. You see this a lot in leadership portraiture, where they're always trying to put forth to you this idea of their strength and might, and the best way you can do that is say, I control everything around me. So he wears certain things in the portrait. The first, of course, is the coronation robe I already mentioned, using the blue color, right, and the fleur-de-lis that make him literally France, right? He's saying, I am France. He then wears around his neck a Catholic cross, which makes him the church. French were very Catholic, and so again, he's sort of tying himself to religion. And finally, of course, there's the sword by his side, which says, I am the military. So he's saying, I am the state, I am France, I am the church, I am religion, and I am the military, I am might. So this is a very specific type of imaging. It goes all the way back to Augustus. If you go back and look at portraits of Emperor Augustus in Rome, this idea of covering all your bases, of saying, I am the church, I am the state, I am the military, I am all these things. It means that people can't really argue against your rule. If you've never seen these symbols before, here's a good slide showing you the symbols of church and state. The fleur-de-lis, of course, in the blue color is emblematic of France. So if you see blue, the fleur-de-lis, someone's trying to tell you, I am French, basically. And then the Catholic cross was a specific type of cross that you saw French Catholics employ. So he wears the Catholic cross around his neck, the fleur-de-lis and the blue color all over the robe. And so again, in a sense, make him into, I am, right, the church and state. That is what I'm representing to you. The other thing we talk about when we talk about Louis XIV is his famous palace that he has commissioned, which is the Palace of Versailles. This was designed by the architect Lavaux. And when he called Lavaux in, Lavaux was like, okay, can we really make this happen? And Louis XIV was like, figure out a way. So I always joke that, you know, the power of Louis was to say to you, like, you will make this happen. You will make this occur. You'll figure out a way to do it. So he calls Lavaux in and basically says, I want this to happen. Now, what was originally here was his father's hunting lodge. So his father had a small hunting lodge here. And what Louis XIV wanted done was to take the original sort of idea, the block of the lodge, let's say, the original foundations and building, and then expand it into a beautiful palace, right? And, you know, people argue about, like, why did he pick this place? Because he already had a palace in Paris, which was the Louvre. Today, the Louvre is a museum, of course, but originally it was built as the palace for the French kings in Paris. And, you know, people were questioning, why would he also want to have a palace out of Versailles? We think that Louis XIV, one of the things he understood is that you control people when you control their movements. You control them when you control their daily lives. In Paris, the court could come to court and then go away. They could go back to their townhouses and whatnot. They didn't have to stay. At Versailles, in a sense, he's creating, as I put it, a golden cage for them to live in. So he's going to move his court out here. Versailles was actually about, you know, today's about an hour outside of Paris by train. So in this time, if you're using carriages, it would have been like a full day's ride in a carriage to get out here. He understood he was taking them out of the proximity of Paris. He was taking them out of the convenience of Paris. In a sense, he was creating a gilded cage for them to live in. So that's one of the reasons why I think he pushed so hard to have the creation of Versailles. Even though Lavaux told him, you know, the ground here is rather rocky and sandy. It's not good ground to build on. And Louis XIV was like, I don't care. And he was like, there's not a lot of available water here. It's going to be hard to, like, you know, create these like beautiful lakes and stuff you want. And even have water for like the household activities. And Louis XIV was like, make it happen. Which you'll notice that Laveau did make it happen. He actually created a long man-made reflecting lake that you see that goes out behind Versailles, and then also multiple little other ponds throughout. But water was so scarce that they actually store it on top of the buildings in these cisterns. So, you know, Laveau kind of had to think about the problems and then solve the problems. But, you know, Louis XIV didn't make it really any easier on him by picking a better location. He wanted to be at Versailles. And again, we think he wanted to create almost like this pleasure palace. To me, that's a very Baroque notion. Creating a place that's about theatricality, it's built from the ground up, it's like an oasis, it's like a dream. To me, that speaks to that flamboyant theatrical nature of French Baroque. The why did Louis XIV insist, right, on having the Palace of Versailles? And I think also he wanted Versailles to be like a place that was about his fantasies and his dreams. As I mentioned, he was a dancer and often performed in a lot of the productions, especially before he was king. And one of the most famous, of course, was the Ballet of the Night, or the Ballet de la Nuit, that was composed by Lully and featured Louis XIV as the sun. So here you have a little sketch of him in his little sun outfit. And he was called the Sun King, the idea that everything rose and set based on his presence. That, you know, the court actually had to, there was a few people in the court who were assigned to be there when he rose in the day and to be there when he set at night. So these little courtiers, they'd stand on this behind this little balustrade or this little railing, and they would watch him get up in the morning and do his toilette or his toilet, right? He'd watch him go to the bathroom and use his chamber pot, right, and use his little toilet, you know, water for the day and wash his face and stuff. And at night, they were there to see him go to bed. So everything was about this mimicking of the idea of the rising and the setting of the sun. And everything about the court was very stage managed. Like if Louis XIV was going to have a new ballet put on that day and it was 8 hours long, people were expected to sit through it. If he wanted to stay up late gambling, they were expected to be there. You know, whatever he wanted, basically, to me, Versailles was a pleasure palace. It was a fantasy for him to indulge his whims and to enjoy, right? The, you know, sort of pleasure of what it had to offer. And everybody there was to me, everybody that was at Versailles with him was like a bit part player. You know, they were like the walk-on people that, you know, come on in a sitcom. They're not really all that important to him, but the scene wouldn't function without them. So he had to have people there to play cards with him and sit through his ballets and, you know, kowtow to him and cater to him throughout, right, his time at Versailles. So again, when I think of, like, you know, the idea of Baroque and theater, I think of those elements. In the next video, I'll dig further into Versailles and show you some of the grounds and buildings and rooms there.